into the Zoom room, we will get started momentarily. Hello and welcome to WITA. I am Ken Levinson, the Executive Director of WITA, and we are delighted you can be with us today. Before we get to today's event, I want to tell you about the next event in our series on worker-centric and inclusive trade. On May 27th, we'll take a look at how investments in infrastructure can impact trade and American workers. You can find information in the program we sent around earlier today to those of you watching on Zoom and on our website, www.wita.org. As you know, if you've taken part in WITA webinars before, we like to mention a few of the people you're in community with, even if you can't see them on Zoom. With over 400 people registered for today's event in 26 different countries, we can't call out everyone, but a welcome today to Aymeric Lachaud at the French Treasury, Gustavo Garcia at MPA Trade Law in Brazil, Jan Farberg at the Norwegian Ministry of Trade, Industry and Fisheries, and Svetlana Fedorova at IPM in Russia. Welcome Aymeric, Gustavo, Jan, and Svetlana, and welcome to all of you. Before we turn to our panel, I want to express our thanks to our Trade and Environment Series sponsor, Silverado Policy Accelerator and the Institute of Scrap Recycling Industries. Thanks to their support, all events in our Trade and Environment Series will be free to attend. If you're watching this on Zoom, you should have received the panelists' biographies by email this morning, so I won't give lengthy introductions here. We're delighted to welcome today's panel, including a couple of old friends and a couple of people who are new to the WITA webinar platform. Welcome back to WITA to Madelaine Tuininga, the DG Head of Trade for Sustainable Development and the European Green Deal. Madelaine was with us at the Washington International Trade Conference in February, and we're delighted to welcome you back, Madelaine. Welcome back as well to Andy Shoyer, who is one of the people the WITA community looks to for expertise in trade law and WTO matters. Andy's been at numerous WITA panels over the years. Welcome, and then a welcome to WITA to two newcomers to our WITA platform, Dave Banks, who served as President Trump's Special Assistant for International Energy and Environment at the National Economic and National Security Councils, and our moderator today, Samantha Gross of the Brookings Institution, who is coming to us today from Berlin, but previously worked in Washington at the Department of Energy and the GAO before joining the Brookings Institution. Welcome, Madelaine, Andy, Dave, and Samantha. If you're watching this on Zoom, you can use the Q&A tab to ask questions of our panelists. And I know Dave's been having a little trouble with his video, but he'll hopefully be popping back in. He is on the session, though, and you'll be seeing him shortly. Samantha?
Thanks so much, Ken, for your kind introduction. And I'm really excited about today's topic. With the Biden administration really moving forward on climate, and also the EU putting forward some really ambitious climate goals. How we're going to actually achieve these goals is a really important topic of global discussion right now. And here in Berlin, where I am right now and have been for the past few months, you really can't have a conversation about this topic without talking about the carbon border adjustment mechanism. It's getting a ton of attention and is a very interesting way for the European Union to try to protect its low carbon industries and industrial production. And so with that, I'd really like to start our discussion with Madelaine to help us get started on the topic and to get up to speed on what the carbon border adjustment mechanism is and its potential role in EU policy. So Madelaine, how does the carbon border adjustment mechanism, or the Cbam as it's called ubiquitously here in Europe, how does it fit into EU plans to meet its own emissions reductions targets? And I know the policy isn't final yet, but the extent that you can divulge, give us some clues about what it might look like.
Thank you, and thank you for the second time being invited for a second time to this forum. Very useful and very timely also that you organize this on this topic. There's indeed I don't think that I have a day passing by without Cbam raising. I was saying the other day, in 10 years' time, we will look at briefings and see Cbam, and people will say, "What's Cbam?" It has its timing now. So what I first wanted to say, asking also the broader context, because Cbam is not an individual measure. Of course, it fits within a broader pack. We've moved we've decided to move forward decisively and to do our share to reach the Paris Agreement goal of climate neutrality. And so, as you know, we are trying to reach net zero commitments by 2050. And in order to achieve that objective, we will reduce our emissions by at least 55% by 2030. Now, that means that we are currently working on a package of legislative proposals to help us achieve this. And this is the so-called Fit for 55 package. And that will be presented in the summer of 2021. It covers both climate and energy, a very wide-ranging exercise with a thorough reform of the EU framework. Now, one of the most important components is the revision of the EU carbon pricing mechanisms, the so-called emission trading system. As you know, this is a cap and trade system. It has performed well, but we need to strengthen it. And in our view, this system, which relies on market dynamics and price incentive, is a key and effective instrument to achieve emission reduction targets and to incentivize the green transition. Now, obviously, as we raise our climate ambition for 2030, we need to strengthen, not only strengthen the ETS and its price signal, but we also need to avoid that these efforts do not lead to carbon leakage, because there will be an increased risk of carbon leakage. And this is why one of our proposals will be the carbon border adjustment mechanism for selected sectors to address this risk. Now, maybe to your second question on the likely content. I mean, you're right. We are right now in full swing in our internal exercise. We are in the so-called stage of an impact assessment, after which we will move to designing a measure. So I cannot go into too much detail, but there are points that I can share. Well, first of all, climate challenge is evidently inherently global, and we want and need our international partners to share a comparable level of ambition. And as long as climate action is not equal to global level, there's this risk of carbon leakage. Second point is Cbam is very much a climate measure. It's an environmental measure. The decarbonization objective would be sharply curtailed if business in certain emission-intensive sectors were to transfer production to another country with less stringent emissions, because this could lead to an increase of total emissions globally, thus undermining the effectiveness. Now, in terms of design, one big part of our exercise we're into now is to design it in a WTO-compatible manner. So importers will be treated in an even-handed manner and would not be subject to an adjustment that is higher than what is applied within the EU. And Cbam will take into account also efforts by EU's international partners to adopt policies and measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from industrial production, including through carbon pricing mechanism. And as the design of the Cbam will complement the EU's carbon pricing policies, in particular the EU ETS, the initial focus could well be on electricity, cement, steel, fertilizers. These are also the sectors that are highlighted and under analysis in the impact assessment. We've been fully transparent throughout this Cbam development, multilaterally and bilaterally. There's been lots of discussions with a range of partners. We've had open public consultations with contributions from over 40 countries. Maybe a little word on process. So we're finalizing the impact assessment. We're still on track for the legislative proposal by the end of June. And in terms of design, there are a couple of options that have been put forward, and they include, as one of them is excise duties, but there is also a system mirroring the EU ETS system. The so-called notional ETS. Now, a little clarification on legislation. What happens in June if we continue to be on track? it is a commission proposal. For those familiar with EU legislative processes, a commission proposal goes then to the two co-legislators, and that is the Council, composed by member states, and the European Parliament. Usually, this process takes about 2 years. And this is also, this would be in line with the target that we have also stated in earlier documents, that we would hope that in 2023. So that is the time horizon that we would have in mind if everything goes according to planning.
Thanks so much, Madelaine, for that overview of what the carbon border adjustment mechanism is. For those of us who don't think about trade and about climate mitigation every day. Dave, I'd like to come to you next and think about where the United States is going with respect to climate and also its connection to trade policy. What direction do you see the US going on an issue that has been really polarizing in the United States? And do you see room for bipartisanship on climate action within the United States? Uh-oh, Dave, are you there?
Hey, Samantha?
There you are. I can hear you. Dave, can you hear me? Uh-oh, it seems we may have lost Dave for a moment. Well, I tell you what, let me move on to a next round of questions and we can bring Dave back in a minute. I think he's having some internet issues. So Andy, let's turn to you for a moment. The United States has tried a policy somewhat like the Cbam before, when during the Obama administration, they were working on the Waxman-Markey bill. How did the idea of a border adjustment mechanism play out then? And has that brought any lessons in that we can use now?
Sure, Samantha. It's like, I feel like it's talking about what I did at my summer vacation, although it was 14 years ago. So here's how it happened. In February 2007, there was a joint editorial by the chairman of our client, American Electric Power, and the chair of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. And they proposed that there needed to be a border measure to address, at that time, what was generally called the China problem. That is, the assumption was the United States would address carbon, and the fear was that China would not. And the objective was really to create leverage, that is, to strengthen the hand of US negotiators seeking to reach a global solution to the global climate change problem. And very much along the lines that Madelaine said, to create something that would pass muster with respect to WTO disciplines. So what I had the great pleasure to work on, what became this IBEW AEP proposal, was integrated into the legislation that was considered at that time. So starting with the Bingaman-Specter bill, and then later the Boxer-Lieberman-Warner bill that was debated in the Senate in June 2008. And the focus was that because it was a cap and trade bill at the time, that one would impose emission requirements on imports so that there was an even-handedness. Essentially, you would be imposing similar regulatory costs and regulatory burdens on imports, but to differentiate among countries based on the extent to which they had taken action on their own to address carbon emissions. When that moved to the House in the fall of 2008, carbon-intensive industries really raised concerns, and they wanted an alternative approach. And so the shift was from a policy focus on leverage, that is, creating leverage for negotiators, to dealing with carbon leakage, which this crowd doesn't need to be educated on, but the concern that, again, if we just regulate the United States, then all production will move to places like China. Again, that was the thought. And so the Waxman-Markey bill that passed the House incorporated a different version of our proposal, but one that was really focused on trying to prevent leakage rather than to create negotiating leverage. And I have to say that some of the lessons learned were, one, it certainly would be a lot easier, and I think I'll be able to talk about that later, but a lot easier to border adjust off a tax than it is off of a cap and trade regime. A market-based regime is tougher. So we'll see how things move forward in the United States. And again, watching very closely the legislative process. The last one, and I think what everybody talked about, is the devil is in the detail. We worked hard on the architecture of the measures so that it would be WTO compliant. We aimed largely around the exceptions, and I can talk about that if there's interest. But a lot of people pointed out that that's really nice, great architecture. The WTO consistency will ultimately depend on how is it going to be implemented. And we never really got that far in the legislative process. So our colleagues in Brussels will, as they work past where we got to in Waxman-Markey, I think we'll have to really address those issues.
Thanks so much, Andy. Dave, I think we have you back, and I'm glad for it, because I want to ask you again about what direction the US is going on climate. And do you see room for bipartisanship on the climate issue within the US right now?
Yeah, hey, thanks, Samantha. And again, sorry and apologies for my technical difficulties. I really regret that. But yeah, look, I mean, I've argued for some time that a merger of climate and trade policy presents an opportunity to build a national consensus here in the United States on climate change. And, I get a lot of people who are really surprised at this assessment because, as we all know, we haven't had any type of consensus really at all on climate change for 20 plus years. And it really, and in fact, I think that that is a huge liability when it comes to global climate mitigation efforts. But look, things are very, very different now than where they were during Kyoto. Very, very stark contrast when U.S. emissions growth had no end in sight. If you looked at the forecast back in 2000, emissions were going up and up and up and up. And so I think that when people were looking at, particularly Republicans, but I think remember, back then, even Democrats agreed with this assessment that Kyoto was not a really good agreement for the United States. And under Byrd-Hagel resolution, what was it? I'm forgetting the year now, but 1995 or so. You had a 95-0 vote in the Senate against what essentially became the Kyoto Protocol. So all of this opposition to regulating and pricing carbon and general skepticism of international engagement kind of stuck, particularly with the Republicans. And so in many ways, we're still recovering from that Kyoto hangover. In 2005, we've reduced more CO2 emissions, absolutely, than any other economy. Republicans love to talk about the fact that between 2005 and 2017, we reduced more emissions than the next 12 emissions reducing countries combined. Now, that is in large part due to the fuel switching from coal to gas, increased penetration. You there?
Yeah, I'm here. I was just gonna see if you were still on.
Sorry about that. So,
it's okay.
I think I was. Yeah, sorry. But while U.S. emissions have increased from year to year several times since their peak around 2005, it's clear that the U.S. economy is becoming more and more carbon efficient, even without the addition of new regulations and policies designed to curb greenhouse gases. A great report came out late last year from the Climate Leadership Council. It found that U.S. manufactured products are 80% more carbon efficient than the world average. The United States imports 75% of its goods from less carbon efficient economies. But really importantly, I think when we're talking about this merger of climate trade policy, compared to geopolitical rivals, the United States is 3 times more carbon efficient than China and more than 4 times that of Russia. So you've got commercial and geopolitical motives here that the Republican Party's picking up that could serve as a catalyst to finding common ground with Democrats, as you know, who are exploring a merger of climate trade policy to really avoid the emissions and job leakage associated with achieving the U.S. net zero target by 2050. It's clear that there's a consensus amongst Democratic climate policymakers that some type of trade mechanism is needed to prevent emissions and jobs leakage associated with that target. You know, you had climate policy reports released in the Senate and the House from Democrats that called for some type of border carbon adjustment. The Biden administration has backed all of that. In fact, it was reflected in the president's recently submitted Paris pledge, right? So I think that it's clear that that's where Democrats are. So we may be coming at it from different directions politically, Democrats and Republicans. Where again, Democrats are more concerned about how do you prevent the jobs and emissions leakage associated with the target, and with Republicans looking at sort of the geopolitical and commercial benefits of merging climate trade. But I think in the end, we kind of land in the same place, regardless, again, of those differences in political motivations. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. That's a really optimistic point of view, which is nice to hear, the fact that the merger of trade and climate could actually be advantageous. And I'm also struck by everything that's happened so far, that the China problem hasn't gone anywhere since the 1990s. Both Andy and Dave talked about it, and it's morphed in its focus, but is still there. Madelaine, I'd like to come back to you for a moment. Now that we've talked a bit about the US side, where do you see scope for transatlantic cooperation on climate and trade? Dave has sort of raised some issues that the US might be open to. Do you see the European Cbam proposal as a help or a hindrance to the process of transatlantic cooperation on climate and trade?
At least once per day, you're allowed to forget to unmute.
We've all done it.
No, I would. Obviously, the EU cannot and should not run this race alone. Climate change is a global challenge, and the solution needs to be global. And I think the first thing to say is that we are very happy that the US has rejoined the Paris Agreement, and we look forward to cooperating very closely on climate action in the run-up to COP, the COP summit and beyond. Because needless to say, if we act together, we will be more effective with mutual benefits. Of course, I think we are now a bit in the trend. It's not we're not talking to each other, definitely not. And I think there's also a declared appetite and objective to intensify that work. But we will at some point need more clarity on the measures that the US will be designing, with the renewed commitments towards 2030, and that is still, I understand, under reflection, although we also understand that Cbam is on the table of issues under consideration. So I think we will need to work along and see how that evolves. Needless to say that international cooperation in this area could take many forms. We are active on Cbam also within the context of the OECD. There's all kinds of important work going on there, including on carbon pricing. And we are very active in the WTO. We are working on a green trade agenda, which should, in our view, include a climate initiative. We are working bilaterally with partners and in the context of the so-called structured discussions. That is a boring name, but this is the name for a group of friends of countries that come together and want to advance a certain topic, and that has happened on trading and the green agenda. And we are preparing for the next ministerial conference now in December. We have in mind to embed climate within a multilateral statement, but we also would like with like-minded countries and countries who want to push the green agenda forward to work on the joint initiative on the green agenda, which would include a climate initiative and work program. Needless to say, and I think this links a bit in what we hear here, today when you talk about a product trade, that something comes at the border, and our concerns are not only whether the physical characteristics of that product are okay, which is more of a classical thing you look at. Actually, you want to know what happened in the supply chain of that product. And this is one of the areas that we think we need to think more about. That includes evidently Cbam measures, carbon leakage, and what happens, but there are a range of other green measures that have a similar phenomenon. I think that in this area, there's also a lot of scope for working certainly with the US, because you have similar concerns in that respect. So I think a lot of areas, I would say more concretely on Cbam, of course, we will need to see a bit how the measures evolve also on the US side. We will then also need to see, and I think it becomes a little bit clear what the exact impact is of the Cbam measures that we will be taking. As I said, we will start with a specific set of sectors. So I invite also those who are interested to look at those sectors and what that means. The impact concretely on the US may be more limited.
Thanks so much. And yeah, the devil is very much in the details on figuring out the specific mechanisms for the Cbam and thinking about how do you treat products that are chemically or superficially identical, but were manufactured in different ways. It's a very new way of thinking about this, but it's very interesting. Dave, I want to come back to you for a moment and see, based on everything that Madelaine has said, and based on European focus on carbon pricing and the ETS versus the route that the US administration is taking, that for right now doesn't include a carbon price because we don't have the votes in Congress for it. How do you see the Cbam as structured today playing into transatlantic cooperation?
That's a really good question. And look, yeah, so you're totally right. So when we're looking at merging climate and trade policy here, and we obviously recognize that, you know, at least those of us who are looking at the politics of this, you know, we understand that we're not going to have a price on carbon anytime soon, unfortunately. And so we're essentially left with trying to figure out, you know, how to translate the U.S. regulatory system as it pertains to greenhouse gases, whether it's direct or indirect regulations. How do you translate that and determine, you know, what the price on carbon is and what a carbon charge should be at the border? I know it's a controversial point, but you know, for trade attorneys, but from a climate activist perspective, look, you know, we're committing to really deep emissions reductions between now and 2050. Well, in between now and 2030, actually, 50% reduction, 50 to 52% reduction. That's going to require really steep cuts that, quite frankly, we haven't actually achieved in U.S. history, but only a couple of times, and that was during COVID and during the Great Recession. So, look, I mean, the politics of this is that it's absolutely essential that we have some type of trade mechanism. So, yeah, so from a climate activist perspective, you know, we hear this question, you know, how does this square with the WTO? I think that, you know, folks in the climate space would say, look, you know, it's time for us to look at how to square the trade agenda in WTO with our climate objectives. So look, so this is certainly going to happen if we're serious about climate change. And look, I mean, I think what the EU is doing, clearly it's headed in the right direction. There's absolutely no way that we can achieve the global targets that the Paris Agreement calls for without some type of merger of climate and trade policy. Now, having said that, I think it's absolutely essential for the United States and the EU and other like-minded economies to work together, potentially to create a carbon club, because we don't have enough market power on our own. You know, whether it's the United States, I think the U.S. accounts for it's around 17% or so of global imports. Okay, If you look at the G7, and if we were looking at it as a group, it would be more than 40%. So you got to have that type of market leverage in order to green the global supply chains internationally, particularly as it pertains to China. How do you rein in Chinese emissions and emissions elsewhere, but in a way that is cooperative? So I think that's the big challenge. How do we work together in a transatlantic alliance with some of our other allies? How do we do that, but at the same time do so in a way that preserves as much of the trade regime as we possibly can?
Those are some really good points. Thanks. And I'll add that I'm starting to see questions rolling in on the Q&A. Thank you very much for those. And if more of you out there have questions, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to send those to us, and we'll get to as many of those at the end as we can. But all this talk about a trade lawyer, we just happen to have one here with us. And Andy, I'd like to come back to you and talk about this issue of WTO compliance. You talked about it just a bit earlier, the idea that a tax might be easier to do a border adjustment than a cap and trade system. Can you tell us how do you thread the needle with WTO compliance and a carbon border adjustment mechanism? And is there a good balance between WTO compliance and effectiveness of the measure? Tell us a bit about how that works.
Sure, Samantha. The good news, and which makes perhaps less interesting discussion, but I have to tell you the truth, there really isn't a huge tension between the trade disciplines and good climate policy. Indeed, WTO disciplines tend to drive good climate and environmental policy. The hard part often is it constrains political choices, but not good climate policy. And let me explain. So let me start with the paradigm here are 2 tons of Portland cement, 1 ton of Portland cement made in Texas, another one made in Turkey. Turkey is one of the largest exporters of cement. As Madelaine mentioned, these are among the sectors. Cement is particularly, as it's made today, particularly GHG intensive. So the US government, let's say, looks at 3 different options to try to constrain that. One is good old-fashioned command and control regulation. EPA says, you manufacture in Texas, you have to make it in this way, you can't do this, etc. That creates regulatory cost, as Dave mentioned. Second, we try to impose a cost of carbon, and that could be through cap and trade, through the creation of pieces of paper and then trading them to associate one piece of paper with one quantum of GHG. And the other is a tax. So you impose a tax either on the product or perhaps somewhere in the chain. The paradigm under WTO law has always been the easiest way to apply it is if you apply a tax on a product made domestically, then you can adjust that at the border with a tax on a like imported good. So the same, that ton of cement, even if the United States has promised the world in its tariff schedule that it wouldn't apply a cost of more than 5% ad valorem on the price of a ton of cement coming in. So that's always been there. That it basically allows one to adjust it, because the way WTO law works, it tells us that even though you're applying a tax at the border, it's not counted the way a tariff would be and disciplined that way. Rather, it's disciplined under Article 3 of the GATT in terms of national treatment. And even if you've made commitments, you're allowed to adjust that at the border. That's the basis. And moreover, there's a lot of wiggle room. There's a lot of flexibility in the ad note, which again goes back decades. That is, it doesn't just have to be tax and a tax, and it doesn't have to be where the US is regulating just the product. It's easier that way. But if you're creating a cost upstream, or if you're regulating a producer rather than a product, it simply makes it a little bit more complicated, but it doesn't take you out of compliance with WTO law. The hard part tends to be when you're applying at the border a a tax or a measure that's to offset either a regulatory cost or a tax, and you want to distinguish as between a ton of cement made in Turkey and a ton of cement made in Vietnam. Now you have an issue because you have an MFN obligation, and that discrimination tends to be problematic. And so that tends to kick you into the exceptions. And there's wonderful literature, a lot of very smart people have written on the topic. And simply to summarize it, there are already exceptions, again, built into the GATT from the 1940s that would allow a government to discriminate if they are doing so, for example, with a measure that is related to the conservation of natural resources, if it's taken in conjunction with restrictions on domestic production or consumption. So if there's a domestic regulatory measure that's really seeking to constrain GHG emissions, then you should be able to offset that. It needs to be even-handed, the term that Madelaine used. That's critical, and we know that from WTO jurisprudence. So again, I think the good news is there's a lot of flexibility here. It is rather that devil in the detail problem, because on the ground, when you try to ensure even-handedness, if it's going to be based on a more complicated set of regulations domestically, then you better be able to count well GHG emissions associated with that ton of cement, because in order to show even-handedness, there needs to be some kind of a clear association. And I think that's been the regulatory challenge for us.
May I follow up on that for a moment? And this is a question that I've had in my own mind, and I can't imagine that I'm the only one. Cement tends to be a frequently used example because there aren't a lot of secondary products in cement. Cement is not a product that's made into other products, like say steel would be, another very high emitting as it's currently made industrial process. Does your analysis change, or how does it change if you think about a secondary material like steel that would then often be imported in terms of, it could be imported in terms of rebar or in terms of automobiles? Does that change your analysis? And Madelaine, I'll give you a warning. I may come back to you on this as well.
Yes, but only in extent and not in nature. That is, the legal analysis, it still should be possible to design and implement a WTO compliant mechanism when you're dealing with something more complicated like steel. Partly it'll depend on, you need to tell me what the domestic measure is. Is it a tax on steel? That's easy. If it's a tax more upstream, then it's more complicated because you have to count up the quantum of GHG emissions and make sure that you are indeed being even-handed. So I think it is still very possible, but it's definitely trickier.
Thanks, Madelaine. Can I turn to you with a similar question? And I understand if this is not something you can answer, please just say so.
No, I mean, I totally agree, and actually I agree with 2 points made also by Dave. If I look at, I happen to be also have been involved in the EGA negotiations, the Environmental Goods Agreement back in that failed in 2016, and there has been a lot of development since then. And for me, one of what I really see also in the dynamics in Geneva is that because all countries are taking such not one but many green measures to implement their international commitments, we are faced with multiple questions in the WTO about this. So it is really essential that we look from, we combine climate and trade and environment and trade, and the trade policy also starts absorbing the underlying objectives. Now on this, no, I totally agree with Andy. We think we can design this measure in a manner that's compatible with the WTO. I do agree that the tax is simpler, a consumption tax, but it's also perfectly possible to sort of mirror the ETS, but because you want to not discriminate, etc., you will need to set up a system that takes into account up to individual performances of operators. And in single cement-centered sector, that may be simpler than in other more complex sectors. At this stage, we're looking at sectors that are still fairly simple. At least these are the ones that have been sort of more highlighted for a first phase in the impact assessment. But I acknowledge that when you get to chemicals and other sectors, These are more complex, but it should not be impossible. We think we can work it through.
Thanks. Dave, any thoughts on how this secondary product and the acceptance of that might impact US politics?
Yeah, look, I mean, this is a question that we have to figure out the answer to. I think that, and look, I mean, you know, depending on the design of this. So, for example, in the United States, you know, although I think, what is it? I think 75% of our steel comes from electric arc, but you know, we still have a chunk of it that comes from blast furnaces. And so I think that, you know, even within the United States, if we, again, depending on the design of this, you're going to have winners and losers. And so we need to dig into the details, you know, as to how that plays with the politics.
Yeah, thanks. And I think, I mean, going forward, at least on a global scale, there'll still be more demand for steel than there is steel available to recycle. So we'll be dealing with those with that primary steel production for a while. I'm looking at some of the audience questions, and I have a question for you, Dave, so I think I'll just stay with you. Mr. Banks mentioned a possible U.S. consensus on climate and trade. Would this consensus actually enhance both climate and trade objectives? Would it only provide benefits on the climate side? In other words, would the Cbam do anything to liberalize and expand trade in goods and services, or would it serve to curtail trade? And that might be an answer that the others might come in on too. But Dave, it was asked of you, so we'll start there.
Yeah, thanks. You look, I mean, I think that, and this is where the Carbon Club is particularly important, right? Because if you have countries that all sort of act unilaterally and construct their own climate and trade policies, I think that's going to be a huge obstacle to trade. I think it's going to result in protectionism, and it's not going to be that effective in global climate mitigation. So let's assume that we have a Carbon Club. So if we have the Carbon Club, then given the fact, again, that the U.S. has a carbon efficiency advantage, and it's roughly today, by the way, it's roughly in the same ballpark as the EU. I think the EU is a little more carbon efficient than the U.S. economy, but we, the United States, is a little bit more carbon efficient than Japan. And again, that's because of the big fuel switch from coal to natural gas over the past 10 years or so. And so I think it's a dynamic situation, right? So I think that if you create the right climate and trade policy, then what's going to happen, and this is what I've been arguing as it pertains to Republicans, is that Republicans, if they see this commercial advantage, and meaning we're exporting more, or we're creating a system that incentivizes more investments in domestic manufacturing, if we're doing all of that, then there's going to be a big incentive to double down on those policies that result in even greater carbon efficiency. So I think it opens up a lot of opportunities on both fronts. But again, I'm assuming that we have to have a Carbon Club to achieve those objectives.
I agree with your point on a Carbon Club and how important it would be to harmonize policies across different countries. But it doesn't seem to be the direction we're going, sadly, because of the opposition in the US to a carbon price. Does anyone else have any thoughts on this question? Or I have a couple other ones I can bring up as well. I see Madelaine going for the mute button.
Look, no, I've been listening attentively to carbon clubs, and I mean, I think there are many aspects to it. But I mean, we talk a lot, and the attention is all focused on Cbam, but to achieve our climate objective, there's a whole range of policies that are at stake. So I think it's also important to bear that in mind. Cbam is in itself a domestic measures that we're taking. Of course, we're keen to develop and design these things in harmony with others. But I wouldn't see it as a sort of define it as a stimulator for more trade. I think we have there across the board. I mean, let's take a product liberalization of whichever product. Take the list that we had in the environmental goods agreement that ranged from energy efficient products to well, you name it. We had 300 products there. All of them will have, in one or another way, domestic measures that relate, or international rules that relate to environment or climate. And I think we will need to see what type of products we think are good to circulate and help the climate, and what do we then do with these non-tariff issues in WTO terminology, which is why I came to this point that we do need to open up a discussion in WTO, starting with those who are committed to fighting climate change, to see, okay, what are your measures? Can we have a discussion about that? Can we agree on principles? Do we have similar frameworks to stimulate that debate, and also start seeing what are the most efficient measures? You can exchange about that, but have a discussion about that and see how we should go about that in WTO. But you will not resolve the climate question by limiting this discussion about only a carbon leakage measure.
Yeah, and Samantha, I guess just to come back to that point, I guess, let's face it, a border measure is bad for trade in a static sense, right? I mean, it's hard to celebrate it from a trade perspective, but yes, as we've discussed, if you look in a dynamic context, if you create a cost of a carbon price in the economies of the world, and you push manufacturers to move to avoid that cost by making carbon friendly products, then in 10, 20, 50 years or something, you may have enhanced trade flows in the types of products that you have pushed. That requires lots of coordinated policy, including thinking about transport costs. But in a static sense, I think we got to be honest with ourselves. It's not good for trade to create a cost at the border.
Yeah, I hear you exactly. And this is a great lead in to another question from the chat that was asked of Madelaine. And that is, does the EU envision the Cbam as a permanent initiative, or does it view this as leverage to create, the question says better global climate policy, but I would also add more consistent global climate policy of the climate club type that Dave is describing. So do you view this as something that's permanent, or something that's sort of a means to an end?
No, I mean, well, at the end of the day, we want to preserve the climate. So in that sense, all we do is a means to an end. No, as I explained at the start, this is, for us, it's a climate measure. We are stepping up our ambitions. We need to revisit and step up our emission trading system. And then as a result of stepping that up, there's a higher risk of carbon leakage. So from that perspective, it is linked to the increased risk of carbon leakage. And I guess that for the foreseeable future, that will continue to be the case. We will start, the ideas that we start in the first phase with selected sectors to later on be extended. The revision of the ETS, I mean, there's a whole range of issues within that as well. It's not going to happen overnight, but I would see for the foreseeable future that we have the measures in place. Yeah.
Thanks. This is a question, another audience question that I think is good to start with Dave, but I think Andy may have some thoughts on this too. How do you see a border adjustment mechanism being implemented in the United States in the absence of a uniform price on emissions? Would you tie it to the social cost on carbon? Would you tie it to subnational markets? Like, how would you set the level in a system like the United States where we're not looking at a carbon price? And I think the reverse of this is true. How would the EU view emissions in the United States in the absence of a US carbon price?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that, again, because we don't have a price on carbon and we're unlikely to have one anytime soon, but on the other hand, we have this political imperative and economic imperative to have some type of trade mechanism to prevent emissions and jobs leakage. Okay, so those conditions are really important to understand. Look, and we're going to have to figure out, and we haven't had this conversation yet, but we're going to have to figure out how to translate the regulatory system. So we're going to have to figure out what the process is in determining what that border adjustment should be, and it's probably going to be by sector, right? Because we have, if you look at the suite of regulations, direct and indirect regulations related to reducing greenhouse gases, it's going to differ from sector to sector. So it's got to be a sectoral approach. We're going to have a conversation about, okay, so, what's the strategic objective for the United States? And I do think, look, my big concern, and I kind of alluded to this before, but my big concern is that the EU comes up with its system, we come up with our system, Japan does its own thing, China reacts, right? And so you have this, you have a dynamic that actually undermines some of the key objectives under the Paris Agreement when it comes to harmonization. So I think we're going to have to do two things at once. We're going to have to figure out, how do we do it here in the United States without a price on carbon? And then at the same time, we're going to have to work with the Europeans to make sure that both of us don't create some type of dynamic that somehow undermines the concept or the goal of building a carbon club. Because if we can't build a carbon club, I don't know why we're doing this, right? It's because, again, it's not going to be effective when it comes to global climate mitigation. And it's going to make the world a more dangerous place, because it's going to create a system where protectionism kind of rules the day. Okay, but so two things at once: figure out how we do it here in the United States based on the regulatory system, but at the same time working with Europe, working with Japan and other countries to design, what should be a carbon club. And again, harmonize as much as we can.
Yeah, I agree with much of what you're saying. And I'll add the point that the EU ETS has become a very effective system with prices high enough to make a difference. But the European Union also has sectoral approaches as well. All the transition that is needed or expected won't necessarily happen because of the EU ETS. Madelaine, would you like to comment on that as well?
No, I totally agree about I cannot say enough that this is an international climate. It needs to be addressed internationally. So we will be very keen to work with partners. As I said, also, what we're talking about is a proposal that will be tabled by the Commission, which then still has a legislative process. So there will be plenty of opportunities. Maybe on the specifics, what we're looking at is a Cbam that does take into account efforts by international partners, that they adopt in policies and measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from industrial production. So that would need to be taken into account. And we may also take into account the specific emission performance of importers. So as they are influenced by relevant policies of third countries, and whether imports are already subject to carbon prices in the country of origin. So it is not that a Cbam would need to neglect the fact that that companies in a third country are not very clean and performant. And as we've learned earlier, US industry, including steel industry, is actually quite efficient.
Thanks, that's really helpful. Andy, any thoughts to bring us home?
Samantha, again, I'm thinking about the points that Dave and Madelaine made, and learning from the IBWAEP proposal. We started out because we were trying to create leverage to produce a carbon club, essentially, to try to create negotiating leverage. Our proposal, or my client's proposal, focused on economy-wide carbon results, and compared that to what the United States have. So it wasn't necessarily dependent on whether you had a price of carbon. It could be done solely through command and control regulations in the United States. But we wanted to focus on an economy-wide approach because we thought that was the greatest leverage. When the proposal moved into Waxman-Markey and the focus moved into carbon leverage, then, just as Dave suggested, it was all sectoral. And the irony there was we needed it, that introduced a WTO legal complexity. Assume you have a sectoral standard, but a importer, a U.S. importer, wants to demonstrate that the ton of cement that they just brought in is cleaner than the standard for that sector. What we tried to learn from the reformulated gasoline case was, well, gee, there should be an option for them to show I shouldn't be whacked because I'm better than the standard. So there we had not carbon leakage, we had policy leakage. The concern was that over time you would lose the leverage that you were trying to produce for that economy, because maybe you're only seeing the cleanest cement here, but if that dirty cement is being produced in country, then the same GHG emissions are going up.
Yeah, I have heard that exact argument in other places, and I'm really glad that you brought it up. Honestly, we could do this all day, but I think this has been a terrific panel and has brought up a ton of interesting points. But I think at this point, I need to hand it back to Ken to wrap it up.
Thank you, Samantha, Andy, Dave, and Madelaine. Somebody's been around trade for a long time and knows how these international negotiations go on. I can say, for the lawyers, Andy, it's going to be really good business if you are getting into trying to figure all this out and you're billing by the hour. It does seem incredibly complicated. We've got a lot to discuss here. We're trying to do with our series on trade and the environment is to look at all these different proposals and see how to help visualize how to stitch them together. How we quantify carbon emissions in the United States and provide a cost that can then be likened to a tax of some sort on carbon, and do it in a way that's transparent and apolitical is certainly not uncomplicated. But I'm heartened by the fact that Dave says that his friends in the Republican Party are also looking for solutions. We certainly hope that's the case, that we can come up with some domestic solutions that can be transferable internationally. So really grateful to all of you. Samantha, you were a terrific moderator. Thank you very, very much for taking on this challenge. We'll have to have you back to help us think through these topics. Madelaine, it's a pleasure to see you again. I'm really grateful for your work and for your willingness to share your time with our WITA audience. Andy, we'll be back to you because you do such a great job explaining all these issues, and we're really grateful to have you. And Dave, next time we're going to work with you to get your camera working, but we're really grateful you were able to get your audio working, because what you had to say matters more than what just being able to see you. So thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for watching. Please stay tuned to WITA.org for updates on our series. Everyone, take care of yourself, and when you're eligible and when it's available, please make sure you get the shot when you can.